Right. Good morning. So it's great so many of you could join us here today. My name is Emma Swan. I'm a partner in our education team here at Forbes, and I'm very happy to be hosting our first AI special. Now, I'm joined today by a number of my colleagues in our education team. So perhaps if we just go round, everyone can introduce themselves. So I'll hand over first to Coral.
Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be here. So I am Coral Petrel. I'm an associate in our education team here at Forbes. I'll just pass over to Yassine to introduce himself to you all.
Thanks, Coral. My name's Yassine. I'm a solicitor in our commercial team and specialise in data protection. I will be going through the IP matters in this presentation. I'll now hand over to Gemma.
Hi everybody, it's lovely to see you. Sorry, you just caught me mid-brew then. I'm not normal till I've had my first cup of tea. So I'm Gemma Duxbury, I'm a partner here at Forbes, and I specialise in education and public sector matters, including data protection, safeguarding, anything really that relates to the public sector. And I shall hand over to the gorgeous Ruth.
Thank you, Gemma. Good morning, everybody. Ruth Mullen, partner and head of public sector employment. So here to talk to you about all things employment related in this session, along with my lovely colleagues this morning. So Emma, I think back to you.
Thanks, Ruth. That's great. So just a little bit of housekeeping, just to let everyone know, we are recording this session today. We will send out a recording and slides afterwards. In terms of any questions, if you do have any questions, please do feel free to put them into the chat, and we will try and come back and answer as many of those as we can at the end of the session. If there's anything else you'd like to cover and you perhaps want to reach out to us afterwards, then we're very happy to take that up and answer any questions then as well. So, as you know, we're going to be speaking today about AI in schools, and this is very much applicable for colleges as well. It's obviously a hot topic. It's getting lots of press at the moment. As I'm sure you all know, AI comes with many benefits, but of course, there are also risks alongside this as well. So it's really important that you have a clear understanding of how you can best make AI work for you. So just as a starting point, I thought it would be helpful, as this is all very new to lots of people, to be absolutely clear with what AI actually means. So in the simplest terms, AI is a term for a range of technology that essentially mimics human thought to solve complex tasks. So basically, the sort of things that we've traditionally done ourselves through thinking and reasoning are now being done increasingly by AI. So day to day, you'll obviously see this, on your phones, on apps. There are things like facial recognition. That's all part of it. On the other extreme, you've got self-driving cars. So that's the new world that we're looking at. Now, decisions that are made using AI may be either fully automated. So that's basically, that's completely down to AI. So we're thinking here perhaps, say, CVs were screened for recruitment. But then at the other end of the loop, you can have a human involved, to conduct the interviews. And that's something that Ruth will no doubt come on to in more detail later on. Now, what I thought I would start with is just an overview of the three different types of AI that you will come across. So there are, moving on to the next slide, there are essentially three types of AI now. Narrow AI. Now, this is a type of AI that can perform limited tasks. So we're thinking here, Siri, Alexa, they can essentially understand and respond to voice commands. There are also reactive machines. Now, as the name suggests, these basically react to stimuli. So I'm thinking here, like movements on a chessboard. These are systems that can note your behavior and then effectively make recommendations. The next stage in AI development is systems that are known as limited memory AI. And these systems can essentially store knowledge, then learn from it, and perform new tasks based on that learning. Now, there's a new subset of AI, and that's generative AI. And that's probably what you're hearing about in the news. So if you just move on to that. Now, generative AI, it's trained on enormous data sets. It can recognize patterns in that data and then draw conclusions about what it's learned. So in the schools context, this can be used now for anything from students writing essays, or rather using AI to help them write essays, proofreading, and of course, from the school's point of view, detecting plagiarism. Now, before I make a start at looking at some of the benefits and risks that you'll see in your schools and colleges, Coral, I wonder if you could give an overview, perhaps, as to how Ofsted and other regulators consider schools should now be using AI.
Of course, thanks, Emma. So as a starting point, Ofsted recognises that AI tools can help schools to make better informed decisions, to reduce workload, and that they can lead to innovative new ways of working. So it supports the use of AI where it improves the care and education of children. As we all know, the inspection frameworks set out how Ofsted inspects schools, including the main judgments that can be made and the areas that will be considered during the inspection. At present, Ofsted will not directly inspect the quality of AI tools used, but the inspection frameworks do enable Ofsted to assess AI's impact on learners as part of the wider inspection and regulatory processes. So it's through their application that they affect areas of provision and outcomes, thinking such as safeguarding and quality of education. So in this context, Ofsted will consider use of AI by the effect it has on the criteria set out in the frameworks. Hopefully there have been some expectations set out when using AI, and those include assuring yourselves that AI solutions are secure and safe for users, ensuring that you can identify and rectify any bias or error, being transparent about your use of AI, only using AI solutions that are ethically appropriate. So again, we're looking at bias considerations before using AI, monitoring any bias closely, and then correcting any problems where that's appropriate. You should be ensuring to set clear roles and responsibilities in relation to monitoring, evaluation, maintenance, and use of AI, and ensure that staff are really empowered to correct and overrule AI suggestions where they consider it's appropriate to do so. And also allow concerns and respond appropriately to them where AI might have caused an error that, for example, has resulted in adverse consequences or unfair treatment. So as well as Ofsted, some other regulators have given their stance on the use of AI by schools and colleges. So for example, the JCQ has stated that it will want to see evidence that pupils have been warned about the use of AI. So this, for example, could be in terms of turning Gemini off on devices that are used for assessments. And the ICO has said that AI will be a regulatory focus, so it will want to see you conducting risk assessments, planning and preparation when using AI. So Emma, I think it would be helpful if you could please let us know where you're seeing AI being actively used in education.
Absolutely. I think it's good to understand the stance that's being taken by the DfE, which appears to be broadly positive and actually embracing the benefits that can come out of the use of AI. So essentially, the DfE has flagged up a number of areas that it expects schools and colleges to be considering. Now, the first to think about is accessibility. So essentially, here we mean schools spending time thinking about how they can potentially personalize learning. So for example, for children with special educational needs, perhaps adjusting the format of a lesson, or using maybe predictive typing to make education more accessible. Then we come on to innovation. Now here, this is teachers using AI to tailor the national curriculum. And also, interestingly, it can include things like AI lab work. So effectively simulating lab work that maybe if you have a child who can't, for whatever reason, come into the classroom, can't access the lab, to actually have these facilities whereby you can potentially do that in a classroom environment online that hasn't been available previously. That's the sort of ideas that are being taken up and flagged up. Also alongside that, there's obviously a general view on productivity that can be improved. So we're thinking here, it's looking at things like marking exams, marking assessments. Can that be done? I imagine obviously easier perhaps where it's a sort of a, there are options for answers, is it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, rather than where you need to give more sort of subjective consideration to the answer. But it's those are the sort of things where AI may assist. Also more broadly, if we think about analytics, so I'm thinking here, monitoring student progress, also looking at your exclusions data in your schools, and perhaps SEN data as well. Then alongside that, there's obviously potentially cost efficiency savings. So that's one of the other areas that's flagged up by the DfE for schools to be considering, are there certain administrative tasks that you can actually use AI to make them automated? So moving on, in more practical terms, the potential uses that we are seeing schools use now day to day could be using AI for everything from lesson plans, also interacting with social media, help with producing newsletters perhaps, producing pupil reports, as I mentioned, marking and assessments. Also, we're finding increasingly particular governors are mentioning it, that they're using AI to help create meeting notes. It can assist with predicting pupil attainments, also recruiting, screening applications, and adapting plans, particularly for children with special educational needs and disabilities. On the other hand, however, and just to flag up, and this is something that's certainly come across to us, and we've seen probably, I think, over the last year or so, AI can sometimes be used by parents in making complaints when it makes it rather more difficult for you as a school to then manage. And this is something we obviously appreciate. Over the last few years, there's been a significant increase in parental complaints anyway, and they've become more complex, and obviously they often involve more parties as parents complain, not just to your school, but to the local authority, to Ofsted, to the DfE. Now we're actually seeing that there are complaints that are effectively generated by AI. So parents are sort of submitting a complaint into the system, coming up with a letter that, certainly from what we've seen, may not at times make a great deal of sense. And also, it throws in all sorts of references to statute and regulation that the school has apparently done wrong. And that we appreciate, that can make life very, very difficult for you, because we're looking at it and going, oh gosh, really? But often when you drill down to it, it's complete nonsense. And it isn't the case at all, but it's just someone has gone onto an AI system, and effectively that's what has been produced. But unfortunately, that's the other side of it, that it means you may need to spend a bit more time and or get that support in managing your complaints. So now I'm just going to move on to looking at what we would suggest a school can best do to implement AI. Now, as a starting point, I would say it's really, really important to be proactive, talk to your staff, and make sure you understand what is actually happening in your school at the moment, because you may be surprised. It could be that lots of things are already happening, but it's not actually, there's no clear sort of strategy or plan in place. So what we would suggest is that you may want to think about perhaps conducting a consultation. So that could be with staff, but it could also be, more broadly with parents and with students. So you see initially the uses that are currently being made of AI, what's working and what isn't. Then you can obviously take that away. That will help you with the next task, which is obviously thinking about putting in place a risk assessment. So where are the clear risks likely to be? How serious would those risks be? What can you actually do as a school to mitigate those risks? So that's some of the initial stages that we would suggest when you're thinking about this, because this is probably one of the things when it's a new area, it's actually making sure that both, governors, senior leadership team has a clear vision, has a clear strategy, and then everyone knows where to go and what they should be doing. So as part of that, we would recommend that schools develop an AI policy. We are increasingly being asked to support schools in putting in place an AI policy. And this will effectively, set out your expectations for the use of AI. Now, what I would also suggest at the moment is you make sure that you're very clear and you have regular communications, not just with staff, but also with parents as well, who may not quite understand, what it is the school is doing and indeed, what they should do. Now, you can communicate with parents to tell them, for example, where you're planning on using AI. It may just be as a starting point, with basic admin tasks. So, sending out letters about school trips, that sort of things. But you can also come on to say, actually, this is how teachers can potentially help students to learn. And also, what for students, what they should be doing, what is acceptable, what isn't in terms of their use of AI, for example, with, writing essays. Once AI has been successfully implemented in your school, obviously that's something that you need to keep under review and, of course, to report any incidents that occur. Now, Coral, I wonder if at this stage you could just give an overview and flag up some of the risks so that schools can obviously think about, what they should be thinking about at this stage when they're looking at conducting risk assessments and deciding where they go from here.
Of course, yes. So the approach to AI, I think, is similar to our historic approach to the internet. When the internet first became readily available, there was concern as to the risk that it would pose to children and how it could and should be used. Now, whilst we're all now aware that the internet can be dangerous, there was no avoiding it making its way into our lives and into our education, and it was absolutely necessary for schools to adapt. And in the same way, the use of AI can be helpful but must be carefully managed. So some of the risks for you to be aware of include, as I've mentioned previously, bias and discrimination. So vast data is used to train AI systems, and if that data itself is biased, we do risk perpetuating and amplifying those existing biases. So keep an eye on that. There's a risk of a change in human creativity. Emma and I were in a school last week. We were sat in a room surrounded by all the GCSE artwork on the walls. And that's obviously something that AI can't replicate. It can't replicate the creativity of the human brain. There's a risk of reducing critical thinking. The ability of AI to produce very realistic written content has sparked concerns that students using it to produce schoolwork might lose their ability to solve problems independently if they become too dependent on AI tools. There are the safeguarding risks. So we're seeing the creation of deep fakes, where someone's likeness, such as their face or voice, is manipulated, and that's into a photo or video to create realistic but ultimately fake content. And unfortunately, that's often done with malicious intent. We're also seeing AI tools creating safeguarding risks. Tragically, Molly Russell took her life after suffering from depression, viewing negative content online. A report identified that algorithms that were used by social media resulted in binge periods of content which became very dark and graphic, and that contributed to her death. So there are safeguarding considerations to be taken into account. There are data protection issues, which Gemma and Yassine will come on to later on. And as Emma mentioned, AI can produce information which is just nonsense. So it's sometimes known as hallucinations, and it's just inaccurate information that you need to keep a check on. There are risks of plagiarism and academic integrity. So if a pupil asks ChatGPT, for example, for ideas to start a piece of work and is given 5 thinking points, another pupil might ask ChatGPT to write a whole piece of work in its entirety. So where's that threshold for cheating? What are pupils allowed to do and not allowed to do? And similarly, tools such as Grammarly can help pupils to rephrase work for clarity. You'd need to sit down and consider, is that considered to be cheating? The information comes from the pupil, but the writing style is supported by AI. The lines aren't clear, so create policies to manage how and when AI can be used. There's also cyber risk and also the risk of potential job displacement and unfair outcomes in recruitment, for example, which I think Ruth will discuss later on. So I'm going to pass back to Emma, who's just going to give some information on the law around AI.
Absolutely. Thank you, Coral. So there basically isn't specific legislation at the moment for AI. There is an EU, but of course, we're not subject to that anymore. So what you have to be aware of is essentially other laws that may be applicable in their effects to the AI use that you have in your school or college. So I'm thinking here, AI can, for example, be relevant if its use may produce, say, discriminatory outcomes that could potentially contravene the Equalities Act. There can also be issues of contract law that can be relevant. It may be that you've entered into contracts for AI services, and so you have to think about the terms and conditions that you're implementing there. There's also, of course, the large-scale implications for data protection and IP law. And on that note, I am going to hand over at this stage to Gemma and Yassine, who are both going to talk through those implications for us.
Hello, everybody. Sorry about that. We've got an errant mouse in the room, as in not a live one, as in a IT one, which is the story of my life with IT. Oh, I can't see the slides. Just bear with me one sec. I'm here today with my colleague Yassine to talk about the data protection and the intellectual property elements of this part of the presentation. And And this is really, really important because, and extremely relevant, obviously. This is a moving feast, and a lot of people are very scared of AI, but at the same time, we also have to embrace it because that's life and we're moving on with that, and we need to make sure that we keep up to date with things. So if we could just move on to the next slide, please. I feel very posh. I've got somebody doing my slides. Look at me. Okay, so as Emma and Carl have brilliantly covered already what generative AI is, here I want to point out the potential risks of actually using it in education. And there are risks in relation to it. One of the main ones is that we've already touched on again as well, is that not all AI tools are the same. There are big differences between what we call open and closed AI, which we'll go into in a little bit down further in the presentation. And there are big differences in the types of tools that you can use and the way that they operate. And as Coral just mentioned on the previous couple of slides, you can get inaccurate or biased outputs known as what we call hallucinations. So from a data protection perspective, the main risks that we identify really are that personal data is misused. So, for example, you're putting personal data, including special category data, into, for example, ChatGPT or something like that to raise a question, and you can't actually do that. You have to be very, very careful, as you are aware, of how you deal with personal data. So that's one of the main risks, is that that gets misused. You then have, in relation to that, you get data protection breaches, and this is where the information gets out into the public domain. And then as well, we have safeguarding breaches in relation to sharing particularly sensitive personal data. And that can obviously be a real issue when we're dealing with children and people under the age of 18. We have some really, really serious situations. I'm not saying that we can't use it, you just have to be aware of the risks relating to it. So, for example, you could put a query into ChatGPT, and provided it doesn't contain any personal data or any personal information or anything at all that could identify an individual, then potentially you should be okay. But when you start putting very specific circumstances or names or areas or things like that, you have to think, potentially, if this went out on the World Wide Web, would somebody be able to be identified? If you could move to the next slide, please. I feel out of control. I don't like this. So as we've already mentioned, you get what we call open and closed artificial intelligence. Now, open generative AI tools, the issue that we have with these is the word open sort of gives it away a little bit. It's open to the public. It is publicly accessible, and it can effectively be modified by anybody. And these systems store, share, or learn from the information that you enter into them, including personal or sensitive information. So this is a case of it doesn't learn this. Oh, what's happening with the lights? We're having a disco here, aren't we? It can potentially, you can end up inadvertently sharing public information. And these systems, they don't create that learning themselves. They don't think for themselves. They learn from what you're putting into it. And obviously this can cause a really, really severe data security risk, because potentially that information can get out there and it will reuse that information. It will regurgitate it, and somebody else somewhere can enter in a query and it will use that information to answer that question. As I've already said, you can get around this by avoiding entering any special category data or personal identifiable information into them. But you do have to be extremely careful when you're doing that, because people can still be identified, particularly if it's very specific circumstances that you're putting in there, or specific details that could potentially lead to someone being identified. So then you've got closed AI, which isn't publicly accessible. So it's considered to be more secure because external parties cannot access what information you are putting into it. And by doing this, it makes sure that you're protecting that sensitive data. Now, for example, I mean, I know I talk about ChatGPT a lot, but that seems to be the most prolific one at the moment. There is an option in there where you can click in the corner which says that you do not share that information outside of your account. So that means that that's not shared out to everybody. It's actually kept specifically to you. So that is a way of trying to protect that information. However, you still have to be very, very careful with what you're doing here, because that we just don't know enough about it yet to be secure with it. And so we just need to be very, very careful. So it's always worth just bearing in mind that you do have those different types of AI. You have open and closed, which are in themselves pretty much do what this says on the tin. And you just need to be aware of potentially what can happen with the information that you input into those systems. And I'll put there at the bottom, it's not always obvious if a generative AI tool is open or closed. So it's always best to double check that with your data protection officer or your head of IT before you're using it. Now, you should be getting guidance and a steer anyway from your trust, or you should be giving a steer on it as to what is acceptable and what isn't. And that should be in your policies and in your day-to-day working style with all of your teachers and your schools or your colleges. So you just need to make sure that you always check these things. But in any event, even if it's open or closed, I would still be very, very careful about what you're putting in there. Next slide, please. So next, we're going to look at the government guidance on generative AI in education. There's quite a lot of government guidance out there. And as is per usual, I find that there's a lot of government guidance, but not a lot of guidance contained within it. It's very cautionary, but there is a lot out there, and they for me kind of state common sense. So, you know, the guidance states that you shouldn't really use personal data in generative AI tools, which I think that we all can understand that, and that you need to make sure that you're complying with your own data protection and data privacy policies and your privacy notices, as well as the main data protection legislation and GDPR. So you also have to bear in mind that you need to be reviewing those policies, reviewing those privacy notices, making sure that they are correct in what you're saying. One of the big things in your privacy notices and in your policies is explaining to people how you use their data, what you're doing with it, because obviously you need to make it clear that you are going to be using their data in these sorts of AI systems. Most people are quite receptive to you using AI, but we just need to make sure that everything lines up and that the policies and the legislation all make it very, very clear about how you're using the data and what you're doing with it. Be open and transparent. I think that's pretty obvious, especially if you're using your own AI tools. And you need to make sure that all your users understand how the data is processed, as I explained in your privacy notices and your policies. As you already know, you need to make it clear in all of those documents for people what data you're collecting, what you're using it for, how you're using it, how you're storing it. And it's just making sure that that's all up to date. Whenever you are using data in a different way, you need to always go back to those documents to make sure that it covers what you are doing. And there is also a suggestion that you can seek agreement to use data in an AI tool. So again, you can obtain consent to use that personal data for that purpose. We could move on, please, to the next slide. So the main steer here as to what you should do in relation to data protection and artificial intelligence. So it's key that you train your staff on the risks of AI. This is really, really important. A lot of people are stressed, they're pushed, they're under the cosh, and they want to be able to make their life easier. And AI can offer that solution. And it's not a case of saying, absolutely don't use it, do not touch it. That, you know, you can't do that. It's not about that. This is a thing that is coming, and it will make efficiencies. It will help people, but they need to be aware of the potential risks of using it. And it's also as well about teaching students about safe AI use. You know, if you're using systems in school, you have to make it clear to your students and your pupils as well what their responsibilities are and how important it is that they are very careful with what information they're putting into these systems. Check if your AI tools are within secure networks. So again, that, you know, we wouldn't expect teachers to do that, but as a trust and as the senior leadership team, we would be expecting you and you to work very closely with your IT department on this. We're working very hard. We've got a working group, I think, haven't we, Ruth, for Forbes that are dealing with AI, and it's been set up for quite a long time now. But again, get those relationships, get those conversations going, get that communication going to make sure that actually they are secure and that you're able to use them, and what the risks and potential problems are relating to those systems. Again, as well, does it comply with data protection and privacy laws? And does it have the appropriate safeguards in place? Again, that's probably sort of your IT and your SLT level, but that's still what you need to be checking. You need to make sure that these systems are safe to use. And obviously, I don't have to explain to you that children's data is a much higher risk. It's special category data. And from a safeguarding perspective, you know, this is extremely important that you are aware of how important we keep this information safe. Next slide, please. So, as I've already touched upon, you need to check your policies are in place. You need to make sure your governance structure is in place, and you need to make sure that you have those schemes of delegation and identifiable officers or people that are in charge of dealing with these things and know what they're looking for and how that gets tiered down through the organisation. You need to make sure that your policies connect to each other, make sure that they refer to each other, and that they, you know, so your data protection policy refers to your AI acceptable use and vice versa. And you need to make sure that AI is covered in not only your data protection policies, but also your staff and student behaviour policies and your device use policies. And that's particularly when you're off site as well, because obviously that can potentially be more unsecure. If you're in Costa and it comes up and says, do you want to share this information with everybody else in the cafe? You don't necessarily want that to happen, do you? So just check that all of your policies have AI in them, it refers to them, it touches on it, it raises that awareness, and that they cross-reference to each other so that people are aware where they can find out and find this information. And we would always, always, always ask you to do a DPIA or a data protection impact assessment. It's mandatory for everything that you're using in relation to AI. It's really, really important to make sure you go through those steps to look at how you're using it, what data is going to be inputted, how it's going to be sent, how it's going to be stored, etc. It's really, really important. So I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Yassine, who's going to tell you about a recent case that touches on this and also flags the importance of data protection in relation to AI tools.
Thanks, Gemma. So as Gemma just touched upon then, a DPIA is needed in certain situations. So for example, with the use of facial recognition technology, which is an AI tool, a DPIA is required automatically given that you're using what's called special category data. So special category data is biometric data. So when, for example, pupils are getting their lunch and they're scanning, if you're using a technology to scan fingerprints or potentially even more intrusive, a kind of a facial recognition technology, then a DPIA is needed in that situation before any type of processing in this situation, having the facial recognition in place actually takes place. So this school here in Essex was quite naughty in that they didn't pay any attention to data protection. And the ICO reprimanded them for that. Ultimately, they kind of got off lucky given that facial recognition, as I mentioned, is scanning for special category data. And as Gemma mentioned earlier, children's data is regarded as vulnerable type of sensitive type of data, not quite kind of your normal special category data, but it's regarded as in the UK GDPR recital 38 as vulnerable parties. Children are vulnerable parties. So both the use of special category data and the fact that the parties themselves are vulnerable individuals means that it's even more important to make sure that you're paying attention to all your data protection elements here. So in this situation, the ICO reprimanded the school for not gaining valid consent. So opt-out is not valid. Opt-out essentially means when you kind of imply consent and then somebody, you know, if the pupils or the parents say that they don't want to be included as having consented to the use of this technology. And then there was no DPO consultation. So the data protection officer for the school wasn't consulted in the situation. And of course, no DPIA was carried out in this situation. So the key lesson here, it's a really great lesson, is to not skip the data protection steps. Don't overlook it. It's very important. Anytime you come across this sort of technology should be thinking straight away, okay, data protection issues are at play here, so we need to make sure that we're carrying out the proper processes. So now I'll take you on to IP. So we've just dealt with data protection and now IP. So if you go to the next slide, please. Great. So there are intellectual property, which is the abbreviation IP, issues when you're using AI. So AI generated work, the key question within law is who is the author or the inventor? So generally human authorship is needed. There's a key case called the Davis case. This was to do more with patents, so not directly applicable here, but the key point that was found was that AI systems cannot themselves be authors. There need to be an actual human author involved. So if a human is generating work themselves, but they're using AI to assist them, then within the law, that's fine. They can gain their IP protection. But if the AI system itself is generating work, it cannot be protected under AI. So this means that it's kind of works that are generated as newly invented works. If they're created just by AI, then they won't be protected. But the key question within schools is, okay, what's the issues then in terms of students and pupils using it, or potentially even staff using it? And the key point is that AI models are trained on data sets, and these data sets can use copyrighted works. So that means the key issue is when a generative AI system, for example, outputs certain results, that means within those results, there could well be copyright work within there, and therefore copyright issues are at play. Now, what are the risks? So if you go to the next slide, please. So the key risks are plagiarism and copyright infringement. So ultimately, who owns the notes and images and essays that are outputted by AI? This is a very kind of tricky area, given that it's not quite clear what data is being used when a generative AI tool, for example, ChatGPT, is generating its results. Now, you can see when using ChatGPT what kind of websites were used and what kind of information was scraped from, but it's not always clear if that is copyrighted work, if it's otherwise protected by AI, or if it's something that's completely clear and fine to use. Now, there's twofold issues here when it comes to using AI in school. So students should be taught kind of intrinsically and also instrumentally. So teaching students is a good way to ensure that they understand how to use AI tools properly. Ultimately, we're in the new reality now. AI isn't going away. It's taken the world by storm and it's going to continue to develop. So students, whether teachers encourage it or not, are using AI tools. They're very well versed in the use of AI and the different types of AI, particularly ChatGPT and Microsoft Copilot. So they can, produce their work on this basis. So it's important to teach them how to use these tools properly because they're going to be using it throughout their life, from the looks of it, but also how to use it, how to understand the AI and IP problems that may arise when they're using it for their schoolwork. So if anyone has watched Educating Yorkshire, there was a very good kind of example of this where a student had produced an essay and the teacher did not believe that they produced that pupil produced that work themselves and had strong suspicions that they used an AI tool. They asked her about that. She denied having used these AI tools, and it created a kind of an issue where it was a bit of a back and forth. Her parent was invited in, and it was essentially difficult because the pupil is denying that she used AI, but there's strong suspicion that, the work that she's produced isn't in line with what she normally produces. And so or anyone in the class even. So it's way beyond what the class would have been able to produce, and particularly the pupil. So this is a good example of issues at play when it comes to plagiarism. Students need to be taught that ultimately plagiarism issues are even more important now with the use of AI, and that using AI tools can get them in big trouble, not just within school, but also later on at university. And it also creates issues in terms of students using AI to do their kind of homework, but then when it comes to sitting actual exams, they can't use AI tools. And so that creates an issue for them, so that, they need to be aware that they can't use AI as a matter of process when it comes to their schoolwork. That is AI, IP issues in a kind of a nutshell. I'll now pass it on to Ruth, who will cover the employment issues.
Thanks, Yassine. So now you've sorted out all the staff. Now we all know what AI is and where all the problems are. Let's just think for a few minutes about what we do about staffing. We've talked through this session, and my colleagues have already said about policies being really, really important. And never is that a truer sense than when you're dealing with employees. Because if we don't tell the staff what the expectations are and we don't set that out, it becomes very difficult when there are issues relating to data breaches or IP infringements or problems with students for us to then discipline staff and deal with those issues and any fallout from those issues. So my colleagues already talked about the types of AI and putting policies in place. But one of the key things that we need to do, and we make no apologies for a bit of repetitiveness on this, because it's important to have policies across the piece on this to sit along the risk assessment, alongside risk assessments, but also to be clear that we're defining what is agreed and accepted use within the workplace, and what is permitted outside of hours as to how that impacts. So you'll all have come across the situations where things sometimes happen outside of school, and whilst we're not disciplining for that in school, we may have to take some action because it has an impact on how that person continues to work in school. And we tend to see that more of a safeguarding aspect. So it's really important to set out what our parameters are quite clearly on how this is being used, where, when, and which devices are being used, and what the expectations are. And part of that will be to generate policies, which, as Gemma rightly said, need to feed into one another, because it's all well and good having an AI policy, but how does that then feature in your disciplinary policy or your code of conduct or your behaviour policy? Are we mirroring those things? And if I could just have the next slide, I think that can best be summed up as on the next slide, which is we need to keep things under constant review, because the change of pace is coming, and it's coming really quickly at us at the moment. So let's make sure that we're keeping those things up to date. Those things are going to help us and making sure that we're on top of it. I think never has it been truer to say you get out what you put in. We've said that about life in general. Now I think it's very true of AI. Some of the things that we're putting in are dictating the things that we're getting out. So we need to be really clear about what this can be used for and what it shouldn't be used for within our schools, and particularly in relation to our staff. If you could move on to the next slide, please. Talking about employment contracts, that also sets out our requirements and information that we must provide to members of staff, things around pay generally, what rates they'll be paid at, what their working conditions are. And at the moment, there was just in July 23, a report which talked about highlighting that pay and hours could be impacted by AI related processes. So if that is going to be the case, there's talk that these processes might have to be included in what's known as the Section 1 statement, which are all the specific statutory details that you have to have an employment contract. At the moment, we haven't had any case law on that. We are expecting the Employment Rights Bill, which is also changing things at the moment. So it's really important just to keep a mind on how is that going to change in the future? do we need to think about how we set out what our job descriptions look like, what our contracts look like, and how our work's going to be done. I think it's really exciting to see that there are ways that this can be used that is going to help us to create efficiencies, but it's making sure we balance and measure that against, you know, that critical thinking that Coral talked about earlier, making sure that we're being careful around bias and discrimination, and that those, by using those tools, those aren't creating those situations. If you could move to the next slide, please. One of the other aspects that's going to be really important as well is obviously to train employees. If we have problems with our employees and we want to consider going down the disciplinary route, one of the things that you'll always be asked by an employment lawyer is what training did they have? How can you evidence that? What did they know about it? How, you know, how can you evidence that? So training is going to be really important for, you know, sharing that information, being clear about what's permitted, what isn't permitted, what applications are being used in the organisation, presumably ones that have been DPIA assessed as well, and making sure that we do that. A survey in September 23 showed only 7% of UK employees had received any training on AI. So again, that's going to be something that I think you're going to have to build in going forward. Next slide, please. So staff must be made aware that unless you've got your own AI model, there's significant risk of the information that could be put in. Gemma's already shared the risks around that with you, but it's really important to make sure those communications that Emma and Coral talked about earlier are shared with staff, so it is clear what those expectations are and how that is going to work going forward. If we don't set those expectations from the start, I think we're setting down a track that we perhaps don't want to be on. So if you move to the next slide, please. This is just a couple of key things to think about how you're going to approach it, what applications you're going to use, what are they permitted to use it for, how is the data going to be used or put in, and who will monitor the outputs, because those checks and balances will need to be undertaken to make sure that we're eliminating discrimination or biased outputs. So for example, if you're using it to help with recruitment, for example, how are you going to assess that the information that you've got back has taken that into account? And I think a lot of us were scared when AI first came out that everybody's jobs are going to go. And I certainly don't think that's the case, because I think there is going to have to be a human element to this, and it's balancing, I suppose, the humans with the robots. If you could just move on to the next slide, please. So if the staff don't check those things and they use AI applications where they shouldn't, using personal logins and things like that, that can interfere with how they're using that and make it so that it's more likely to go wrong. So if you are using things like work logins and personal logins, making sure that there's a clear distinction between those and what's permitted and what isn't. Using personal logins are always quite tricky for employers because it doesn't allow you to control the usage as much as it does for a work login. And if that person leaves, it can be, you've got no control over terminating accounts and things like that. So again, just being mindful of that and making sure that that permitted use becomes part of any induction or onboarding process at the start of employment. Next slide, please. We've talked about being mindful of risks of discrimination, and it is difficult to see how that's going to work when you've got a World Wide Web out there that you are putting information into and getting information back. This is why there is this caution about what the information is that's going in, and it's about how you're making those decisions from the information that you're getting out. So it's being alive to the fact that the information you may get out isn't necessarily accurate and fact checking and making sure that that complies with your processes. So think about discriminatory outcomes and how we make those work. There's also the risk that we can lead to what's known as digital exclusion, which can be where sometimes older people or disabled people aren't able to use AI as easily or as readily without proper training and without the knowledge to do so. And that's going to be a focus in the Equality and Human Rights Commission guidance around this, is that we've got to be very mindful of that, because that is something that we could tip into relatively easily if we're not aware of it. Next slide, please. So AI can promote efficiency for workplace tasks. We've had for a long time the unions arguing to say that teachers' workload is heavy. We know the workload is heavy, and there have been lots and lots of disputes. I've been involved in some myself where, you know, we're talking about marking and those sorts of things. AI can likely help with all of this, but it's about how we manage that and getting those checks and balances in place, and perhaps working with our trade union colleagues to build those relationships and those policies around how we can actually use it for everybody's benefit. I'm conscious that we want to get to questions, so I'm going to flick through the next two slides, which are what could go wrong, which is obviously disciplinary action, consequences of things being used outside of permissions. We've already heard from colleagues about data protection, safeguarding. We've got regulatory, reputational implications, and also the IP issues. So there are lots of things that can go wrong. That's not to say don't do it. We're obviously saying it's a positive, let's use it. And just the last slide, please, if I can. I wanted to just bring this one to you to say, the solicitors are not immune either. We have had cases where some lawyers have used AI to help them prepare their cases, and unfortunately, and it's happened from claimants and lawyers as well, they've put together from AI completely fictitious legal cases and have cited them in court. Not a good look on any day of the week. So just to reassure you, you're not the only ones that this is happening to, but it's a real serious issue of that fact checking and us understanding. So I think we can now come to questions, and I'm going to hand back to Emma to handle the questions.
Thank you, Ruth. That's a very good reminder to us all that we're certainly not immune, and to be aware that, yes, what you read that's been generated by AI may just not be correct at all. And I've certainly seen that with my little one, who's, I think, probably more advanced than I am in some ways of, you know, what he can do on the computer. But I know he was showing me something the other day, and I was thinking, that's just not correct. That really can't possibly be correct. And it's just having that, you know, level of knowledge and experience that we all do have to say, actually, okay, we can recognize that this isn't right. But sometimes that can be a bit more complicated. And, you know, you just have to take that on board and just be aware. So moving on, now we obviously would like to try and answer some of the questions that thank you for posting. So the first question that has come in is that practical question. In the same way, we cannot keep an eye on all the content of the internet our students will access. Then the same thing obviously applies to AI. So can we be clear about what we mean when we're saying keeping an eye on bias or inaccuracies, to kind of give you some tips, so how you can even begin to do that? Do we want to say, is that one? Ruth or Gemma, is that something you'd happily chip in and answer there?
Yes, certainly, Emma. I think, yeah, it's a really valid point. You know, there's a lot of information out there, and there is a lot of information that you can't control. But when we're talking about keeping an eye on bias and inaccuracies, I think what we're really driving at is, if you're using AI as a tool to give you information, and I think I just gave that example about recruitment, but it can apply equally anywhere else. If you're making a decision based on information that you've got from AI, I think you've got to be clear that the information is accurate. You know, making sure that you fact check that, and look out for that kind of stereotyping things coming up in terms of bias and leaning. You know, if you've got, let's say you've put anonymized data into AI to choose the best candidate for a job, are you then going back and looking at that again and saying, well, has the computer come up with the right answer? Does that information you know, flag up any of the issues that we would have to consider? So I think it's about being alive to the fact that the information that you're getting won't necessarily just give you the answer, and making sure you've still got that critical thinking around your discrimination policies and your stereotyping. Gemma, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything on that.
I don't think there's much else I can say, really. I mean, obviously, it's just a risk that you take, and naturally people do have bias, and they do rely on things that they've heard third hand. So I think you just need to be, this all ties back into the whole making sure that your training's correct, and all those types of things, to try and avoid the situation where potentially that generative AI might give you an answer that does lean a particular way because of information that you've input into it.
I'm just going to pick that up again, Emma, if I may. The lady who'd asked questions asked another question, said it's really more about students rather than staff in terms of keeping an eye on the biases and things. I don't know whether, Emma, you want to answer that.
Are we still on?
Yeah, no, you're right. Thanks, Ruth. I've just seen that. So I think we're not saying for one moment that you can keep an absolute eye. I'm sorry, can people hear me?
Yes, can hear you, Emma.
It's coming up saying Zoom was quitting, but that's great.
We can't hear you now, Emma. Have you gone?
Yeah, unfortunately,
Yeah.
I think Emma may have frozen. I think, you know, the answer to that really is to do with how we monitor that, and it is very difficult with students. But if we do look at, you know, the types of AI that they're using, we should be able to at least monitor the sorts of things that they'll be looking at, and looking at perhaps answers and things that are coming back. I think Emma's system has kicked in again. Emma, did you want to take that back?
I'm so sorry, Ruth, if I disappeared there. Yes, what I was saying is what it's important for you to have as a school is very much the framework. So it's when we've been talking, and I appreciate we've all mentioned this very much, it's having the policies in place so you can actually say and communicate with, you know, parents, with the students. This is essentially what you should be doing. No, you're not going to be able to cross-check every little thing that they do, but if there is a problem, you can point back to, actually, you know, we've set this out clearly, and we think here there's a potential breach of, you know, policies and procedures. So that's probably where we're coming from more on that point. Just looking at other questions, I think this may be one for you, Gemma. We're being asked, if you shouldn't be putting personal data into AI, would you even need to reference it in your privacy notices?
I was just checking the microphone was on. So fortunately, thanks, Emma. Yeah, it's not a stupid question at all. So whoever's put this has said it's a stupid question, and it's absolutely, you know, no question is stupid, I don't feel, in this arena. But basically, I think if you can be 100% certain that absolutely nobody is going to put personal data into AI, then that would be okay. But I personally don't think you will ever be able to guarantee that every member of staff, that every student, that every person using that system is not putting personal data into it, then that would be quite an interesting place to work, because that sounds like you've got very much you're in control of the situation. And what we find is it's always better to have it in your privacy notice than not, because even if you don't use that personal data, and you don't input that into your AI tools, it's just in case on that one occasion, or if that one person does do it, you have already got your back covered, because it is in your privacy notice and it is in your documents. So for me, it's a case of sometimes it's better to have more than less. And at the end of the day, it's a protection that is there just in case it happens. I don't think it necessarily you would ever be able to say that you can 100% guarantee that nobody would put personal data into it. So just to cover your back, make sure that you're going to let it be known and let it be out there. Look, we might do this with your data.
Thanks, Gemma. That's really helpful, and I think that's kind of that's a general position that's taken by lawyers. So, you know, dot all the I's, cross all the T's, try and make sure you've done everything you possibly can as a school to protect your position. We just have, I think we've got time for one further question. Where this is sort of a comment about facial recognition. So I think this may be one that Yassine can come back on. So it's pointing out that facial recognition is obviously completely different to fingerprints, and that generally student lunch systems don't take fingerprints as such, but actually effectively it's a pattern that's converted into a binary code, and fingerprint isn't stored at all. So I wanted to see if you just wanted to make any further comments about that could be helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I think this is a good comment, is an important point. I have to disagree to an extent on this one. So facial recognition is not, from the perspective of data protection and the need to carry out DPIAs, are not completely different to fingerprints, but I understand what's being got at here. Facial recognition is more intrusive than fingerprinting. As the commentators rightly pointed out, the fingerprint is converted using a numeric or algorithmic template to essentially a format that can't be linked back to the original fingerprint. So generally the fingerprint isn't stored, the raw fingerprint. And so that's good kind of protection, but that doesn't necessarily mean that a DPIA is not required here. So the facial recognition and fingerprints, from the perspective of data protection and from the perspective of requiring DPIAs, should be looked at the same, in that a DPIA should be carried out, and at the very least a screening at first to see whether a DPIA is needed. But the requirement for, conscious of time, but just briefly, the requirement for a DPIA is where there's a high risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals, and generally automatically a DPIA is needed where there's a kind of a large scale processing of special category data. As explained earlier, biometric data is special category data. Biometric data includes fingerprints and facial recognition. So for the purposes of data protection, they should be looked at in the same sort of way. As also rightly pointed out, in the last 10 years, fingerprinting has been used. So that's a kind of developed system. Data protection practices as such have kind of developed in that way, but a DPIA should still be carried out. The DPO, the data protection officer, or anyone else dealing with data protection within a school, for example, should be aware of this already and should have systems in place already, but should still carry out a DPIA to ensure that any risks are identified and then mitigated, and to ensure that any raw fingerprint data isn't stored, anything that is stored is encrypted, and that any kind of risks of data breaches are identified. As generally might say that it's, one could say that you can't link the algorithmic data back to the original fingerprint, but that's not always generally impossible. So always looking at the potential possibilities for a threat actor, so for example, a hacker, to be able to link the data back to and reverse engineer the data back to the original fingerprint should be looked at in a DPIA. So hopefully that kind of deals with that kind of comment, but it is an important point. So thank you for raising that.
I think as well, just to add to that, Yassine, by doing the DPIA, even if you don't necessarily think it's relevant or agree with it, it's showing that you're doing the process, doesn't it? It's showing that actually you've got that audit trail to show, right, okay, even though potentially we think this is safe, even though it's a binary code, we are still checking that this is okay with data protection, and we are still going through the required steps to make sure our data is safe.
Thank you. That's super helpful to clarify that point. I just wanted to say now, thank you to everyone, to all the panelists for taking part today, and thank you to everyone for coming along and listening. I hope it's been helpful. Obviously, I appreciate it's an area that is going to be constantly changing over the next few years. So I have no doubt we'll be sort of back here again with an update at some point. It's been lovely to have people on board asking questions. And as I mentioned at the start, if you have any further thoughts or questions, please do reach out to any of our team, and we'll always be very helpful to support you where we can. So I'll say thank you for now. Goodbye to everyone, and I hope you all have a great day. Cheerio.